Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, so we have a room full of people, and we've been conducting the Gita study group up to now informally. But we decided to go ahead and record. So it's going to be a little different, at least this recording. So have patience, because I'm hoping this will be the last time I have to do this. I've been teaching the Gita off and on since 2001. So I'd like to just have this be the conclusive summary of the gist of the Bhagavad Gita. So what is the Bhagavad Gita? The Bhagavad Gita is a scripture that came from India. Its origins were not written, they were chanted. And to this day, the Gita is kept intact through rote memorization and chanting. It was translated into word Sanskrit somewhere 1500 before Christ, and was converted into English in the early 1800s, and was a very powerful influence in the transcendental movement that occurred here in the United States with Ralph Waldo Emerson and others, just reading the English translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, as you all know, my spiritual awakening happened spontaneously, and what was very clear to me when it was occurring, that I wasn't doing anything, that something was happening to me. And it became very clear that what I was experiencing was a natural process, that it was something that we all go through if we know it or not. It has a beginning, middle, and end. In the same way a seed planted in the ground first has to emerge from the seed as a root, striving without knowing it's striving in the darkness and the dirt and the rock and the mud, eventually not even knowing it's striving until it breaks through the surface and then experiences the dimension of air and sun and warmth and cold, and a whole new paradigm opens up. So we're all actually in a maturation process. We're all seeds that have sent out shoots and have, over time, through lifetimes in the Hindu tradition, been growing, maturing, developing, and there will come a point when our maturity, our development is sufficient that we begin the last stage of the journey we're all on. So we're all consciousness. That's what we are. We're not our personalities. You're not who you think you are. You're not your story. You're not your memory. You're not your body. You're not your moods. You're not your feelings. You're not your thoughts. Those are only a byproduct of you as consciousness getting tangled up with matter. When you come on the return journey, this entanglement of you as consciousness becomes disentangled over time. And you recover who you actually always were in this process of disentanglement. We're all born into life in the middle of things, right? Our parents aren't enlightened. The people we live with aren't enlightened. People don't know who they are. They're basically born in the middle of their culture and their family and their circumstances. And we come out of our childhood taking everything for granted, not knowing what it is we're taking for granted because we didn't know anything else. So we walk into life, I say, in the middle of the story. And that's basically why I wanted to spend this first session giving you a sense of perspective of where you are in the story, or what I like to say, where you are in your own journey of consciousness. So I'm going to stand up and point to this diagram. This diagram reflects the culmination of both my own experiences and the understanding of my experiences that has come over time, and being able to put what has happened to me spontaneously and naturally into a structure of languaging. And I'm very indebted to the Bhagavad Gita in terms of giving me a large enough frame for being able to contextualize my experiences and of course to my teacher Sri Atmananda for having demonstrated what it was that I was engaged in and was able to give me clarity when I didn't know what it was I was experiencing. So what this diagram shows multiple things, and some of which we'll explain, most of which we'll explain over as we do the Gita over these next 18 chapters. The Gita has 18 chapters. It's a small book. Let me have a cleaner version. That basically describes the entire journey of consciousness. However, it's only one segment. It only describes the last leg of the journey of consciousness. The book in which the Bhagavad Gita is a part of, called the Mahabharata, describes the whole journey of consciousness. And that's what I'm going to point to here briefly before we go into this first class. Consciousness emerged from a quiescent state I call the Sat. And it was expressed as a radiance, as a seeking that arose from that quiescent state to know itself, to experience, to wake up. And this caused it to descend into matter, into the dimension of existence, and become identified with it, to identify itself with soil, to identify itself with rock, with mineral, with element, with vegetable, with insect, with fish, with animal, and eventually to us. And this process of consciousness descending and then becoming entangled and engaged created a more and more sophisticated understanding or development of our consciousness, which we now call our intelligence or our mind. So we developed a body, and then we developed a vital, and we developed a mind. And out of the mind, we human beings, reaching the end of the maturity of physical evolution, developed self-aware intelligence, the ability to choose and to take actions different than what we were programmed with by nature, which is run by instinct and programming. But we still carry much of that instinct. So man in its first self-awareness is basically an intelligent animal. Still an animal, run by instinct and needs, cravings, wants, fears, the urge to survive and to succeed. In human being, we begin a journey of a different order in evolution. We begin to become more and more subtle, less and less animal, and more what we would call human. The human development, the refinement of the human consciousness comes over lifetimes and lifetimes. And on this chart's reflected in this journey. And we become more and more free of our identification with our mind, with our body, with our impulses, with our instincts. And in this way, we disentangle ourselves from this ancient embedment in consciousness, of consciousness with matter. So we're all a product of a movement, a current, of which we're an individual expression, of consciousness getting entangled with matter, becoming less and less entangled until the point where who we are as consciousness wakes up. And at this point, at this transition, we begin an ascending journey, returning back to our original condition, but this time with self-awareness, with the ability to know, to choose, to think, to act. So this last stage of the journey is what the Bhagavad Gita describes. So this part, this transitional part, is what we're going to talk about today. What's called in the Bhagavad Gita, in the first chapter, the Yoga of Dejection. It is when the consciousness begins to shift from its investment in its identification with matter to its investment with its identification with itself. In the Gita, it describes stages of the journey, including the return to the original state of who we are originally, of what we are originally, and even goes further and describes a state of consciousness where we return back into the evolutionary process to assist other human beings to evolve out of it. So the journey of the Bhagavad Gita shows a state where we come to the first realization, which is we are consciousness. This is not just a realization. To become stable in the knowing that we are not our thought, but we are that which has thoughts. We are not our feeling. We are that which has feeling. We are not our body. We are that which has a body. That state of realization, it is real for you, occurs approximately the first third of the journey. Not always true for everyone. Sometimes that may not occur to just towards the tail end of the journey, but for the most part, the Bhagavad Gita is describing a more average awakening process where we wake up to ourselves as consciousness as more real than our identification with our memory and our story and our body and our life. The second state is when this consciousness then begins to merge with the universal principles of consciousness that as individuals we only have a piece of. And as we merge into the universal principles, much bigger forces start working in our system, and our human vehicle has to be transformed, expanded, made more capable of being able to absorb and accept these increased energies and experiences that come when we move out our individual identification into our universal identification. And we eventually wake up to who we are as consciousness, no longer as an individual, but consciousness as the same consciousness that exists everywhere all at once. And this is a state of oneness, the state of God merger, or this is a state of realizing ourselves as the universal. Step out of our individual identity into our universal identity, and that becomes real for us. In Sanskrit tradition, in the Hindu Vedic tradition, it's the I am that stage. It's the state where I am that which pervades everything. I am the God that is everywhere. I am the all-pervading awareness and truth. Eventually, this state completes in a process where the consciousness merge with its origin. This is a complete, utterly indescribable state. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's the 15th chapter. And in this state, most souls end their journey. Out of this state, a few souls will come back into the world to manifest that complete integral wisdom into their personality, into their body, into their emotions, into their mind, and become a vehicle for this universal force to work through the person's individual form. These are the great teachers. Everyone who's traveling on this journey carries much more force, much more consciousness, much more love, much more knowledge, much more presence than an ordinary human being. No matter where they are, when the journey has actually begun, they become a radiation of the truth and the oneness that actually pervades its existence. They become a channel for the force of truth consciousness, which is what it is we're seeking to be channels of, which expresses itself always as what is real and in a state of oneness. I call it the truth love. The Hindu's word for that is Sat Chitananda. And this is the current as it disengages from its identification with matter, flows freely and powerfully through each individual person. This is the source of all spiritual experiences that occur as it moves to the place which is beyond all experience. Okay, that's the context. That's where we're starting this story. Any questions? We talked about this last class, but it wasn't videoed, so I'm doing it now. I've got to remember not to touch this mic. Okay, so now, let's get into the first chapter. First, I'd like to talk about how I plan to do the Gita study group, which is that we will read a portion of each chapter, and then I'll have commentary. People will have an opportunity to share their insights or their what stood out in the chapter that they wanted to comment or share about, or questions that may arise. So when you're studying the Bhagavad Gita, the first thing to do is to read the chapter preferably even write the chapter before we do the talk in order to connect yourself with the questions and the things in that chapter that stand out for you. And then you bring that with you to share, to participate with me, and then we'll expand on that in our interaction as we go through the different aspects of the chapter. We're going to go as far as we can get. We'll see if we can record this whole process. That's yet to be discovered. If Prakriti, the creation, will allow us to do this, but we'll take one step at a time. Okay. So Satyamayini has a handout that she's going to pass out to all of you. And those of you who are watching the video, and this will probably be available on our website so that you could download it for those who want to study along and follow along on your own. The Bhagavad Gita is a story, but the story is an analogy of the journey. Of course, it was revealed thousands of years before Christ was born, so it was really a very human story about a warrior who is in the midst of a battle, or about ready at the start of a battle, with his charioteer. The warrior, his name was Arjuna, and the charioteer was Krishna. Arjuna is the seeker. Krishna is the divine guidance that either exists within each of us, the divine person that exists within each of us that we begin to access. The beginning of the journey is a battlefield. Arjuna is aligned with those on his side against his cousins and relatives that are on the other side. The opening scene of the Bhagavad Gita is a conversation that's occurring from the opposite side about the battlefield, describing the scene and the situation. This battle is an analogy. It's an analogy between the dark and light forces within each of us. The dark forces are those associated with what I call the error of evolution. The process of matter creating vehicles suitable for consciousness to evolve in was a process of trial and error. A lot of species came and went in the process of developing a human body and a human system. So what we have and what we wake up into is a body is a byproduct of an evolutionary process that was there as part of the original intent of this creation. And when we wake up into a body, we are very much affected, still identified with ourselves as our body and our emotions and our thoughts and our memories and our experiences and our preferences and our attractions and repulsions. And when consciousness begins to awaken, it is having to move out of that identification. And there will be this movement of consciousness returning to itself, which is the movement to light, to good, to truth, to love. Or it'll be those movements that will be counter to that, which is the movement to darkness, to ignorance, to comfort, to pleasure, to the habit of the body, to the habit of that mechanism of survival and success. So these are the two forces the Bhagavad Gita is pointing to. So even though it describes it as an outer battle, and we will address the analogy to some extent as a story, but its analogy is really this struggling, this battling between our old habit of who we thought we were and this new state of being that has yet to articulate or become fully conscious. So it can be a very tortuous period, especially at first, because the awakening process, which the first chapter points to, is not occurring just in the mental plane. It's not occurring just in the emotional plane. It's not even occurring just in the physical plane. It's occurring at the level of consciousness. That the soul can no longer be held in matter in the way it's been. Spirit can no longer believe or tolerate its bondage in matter. So I always like to say that dejection is when the soul of us, the consciousness of us, the core quality that we are, wakes up to its bondage. It becomes aware of its suffering. It becomes aware of the inability of it to find fulfillment in all the usual forms of fulfillment of our human life. And it has a longing for something greater, something higher. But the mind may not know this. The emotions may not know this. The body may not know this. But in this moment of awakening, a process is set in motion. Just like a caterpillar who suddenly doesn't know why, builds a cocoon. It's a natural movement that occurs, a natural stage. Learning, understanding the natural stage can allow you to collaborate with it. And this is the whole premise of the Bhagavad Gita. Understanding the Bhagavad Gita, intellectually even, will assist you in preparing to collaborate with a process that has already started. There's no one in this room who hasn't gone through this or isn't continuing going through this. Dejection is something, it is not a one-time deal. It often happens with fits and starts. Tries to awaken and then collapses. Tries to awaken and collapses. It's like waking up from a deep sleep. You're so torpid and taken over in slumber and sleep that waking up for it is a struggle. So dejection is a process. It comes, tries to awaken and collapses. Comes trying to awaken and collapses. So this process actually continues all the way up until the soul comes to the self. And then the dejection that occurs beyond that point is of a different order, nothing like this order. So everyone is engaged in this process of awakening, and you don't know always what it is that is awakening. You don't know what's wrong. You know something's wrong, but you don't know what's wrong. All you know is that you want to get out of it. You want to make it not wrong. You want to come out of whatever it is that's wrong. Maybe you know that much. So the first part of the Bhagavad Gita is about this initial emerging, the cocoon having reached sufficient readiness to begin to dissolve its identity as a caterpillar. So it's the beginning of the dissolving. Ask the caterpillar, how's it feel? If the caterpillar could language what it feels like when the dissolving process begins, then it would probably be bitching and complaining like many of you do. This would hurt. This hurts. I don't want to do this. How can I make it stop? Give me some pills. Let's get drunk. Let's get high. Give me some friends. Let's get laid. Give me another project, another job, another relationship, anything but this. It's a state of dis-ease. Before, like I say, ignorance is the state of not knowing you don't know. Waking up for ignorance is the beginning of learning you don't know. Usually by thinking you know, then finding out you don't know. So in the world, this process is not as painful. But in the process of transformation, this process of what appears to be transmutation, but this disengagement of consciousness from its identification with matter, can be very disturbing, very distressing. Okay. So let's begin by reading the verses of the Bhagavad Gita. We're in chapter 1, Arjuna Vashada Yoga. I don't want you to be tied into the names or the descriptions of this. We're going to go through this first chapter in kind of a broad sweep and not get focused. But the handout will give you the meanings of the names, and we'll look more in the overview of the picture. So we'll start with Sachimai. Sachimai, would you read the first 3 chapters?
Okay. So chapter 1, Arjuna Vishada Yoga, the yoga of Arjuna's dejection. Dhritarashtra said, "Tell me, Sanjaya, what did my sons and those of Pandu do after gathering at the field of Kuru, the field of Dharma?" Sanjaya said, "Seeing the army of the Pandavas arrayed for battle, King Duryodhana approached his teacher Drona and spoke thus. O master, behold this vast army of the Pandavas. Your talented pupil, Drupada's son, has marshaled this army for the battle. In this army there are mighty heroes and archers like Yudhahana, Virata, and Drupada. Each of them can be compared with Bhima and Arjuna in battle."
Keep reading.
Dishtataku Chidatana, the valiant king of Kashi, Purujukubuja, and Sabaya, the best among men, are also there. Moreover, they have other great and mighty warriors like Yudhahamanu, Uttamaja, the son of Subhadra, and the sons of Drupadi. O best among the twice-born, I will now tell you the names of our distinguished generals.
Keep reading.
All right. Foremost among us are thyself, Bhishma, Karna, also Kripa, the ever victorious in battle, and there are others like Ashwatthama, Vikarna, and the son of Somadatta. There are also many other skilled warriors equipped with various weapons and missiles who have risked their lives for me. This huge army of ours under the command of Bhishma is quite strong, while the other side, led by Bhima, also appears to be adequate. Therefore, all of you remaining in your respective positions must protect Bhishma on all sides and all fronts.
Okay, so this is the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. It sets the place and the circumstances. The first verse describes the field of Kuru, the field of Dharma. Field of Kuru is the field of action, the field of engagement, the field of struggle, the field of effort, the field of trying. And the field of Dharma means it is through this action that the true path is discovered. It is through the struggle, it is through the effort, it's through the ordeal that how to live and how are we to be and how are we to collaborate with this process becomes apparent to us. So this is the context. The context is that without struggle and effort, nothing changes. When it's all good and everything's smooth and easy and everything's going well, you're not growing. You're not disengaging. You're not evolving. You are found a zone in which the current sense of self, which we call ego, which is the identified portion of spirit in matter, is this interface between the two, is comfortable with what it's come to. It's come to some ability, some skill from previous effort and struggle has reached a certain culmination of things. There's sufficient understanding. There's a sufficient skill and capacity to be with your current circumstances. That's why they seem comfortable. So these are the rest zones. These are the periods of life which many people try to stay in for their whole life, avoiding any pain and suffering if possible. Right? As soon as it starts hurting, then we take some medication, we try different people, we try to fix it, we try to make it better. Because we think that the solution to life is this idea of happiness, which isn't true happiness. It's a temporary pause in the battle, where we try to avoid anything that would remind us that we are actually in battle. And we take claim to those things around us that keep us comfortable and have us feel secure and happy. Sorry, it doesn't work like that. It didn't work like that. If you look at animal life, striving, avoiding being eaten, to eat and avoid being eaten, to survive every day was an uncertain principle. It's like the lizard wisdom, which is, if I can get home and not be eaten, it's been a good day. So it is the dog-eat-dog reality if you look at nature. It is bestial, it's cruel, it's dangerous. At any moment, in fact, any of us could die or be hit or be harmed or be diminished in ways that we can't imagine in this moment. So this whole thing we put away from ourselves. We pretend it's not there. We build houses, we create governments, we create societies, we create bank accounts, and we create ideas, and we create ideas who we are and how the world is so that we don't have to be present with this ultimate vulnerability that being identified with a body creates, right? Because once you're identified with a body, what do bodies do? They get born, they live, they get old, and then they die. So you just might say life is a terminal disease, and we're pretending it's not. We don't even want to have the conversation. We don't like being around people who remind us about that. We don't want any experience to come to us that would remind us of our vulnerability and our temporal existence, the death sentence that we all carry with us. We pretend we don't die. Now, in one part of it, there's a part of us that this is a truth, but not as the individual ego. So we live in striving to avoid effort, yet effort is the only way we evolve. That's true in nature, and it's true in each one of us human beings. And what is it? Why doesn't evolve just go on naturally? Why don't we just keep evolving? Because of the past habit of previous stages of evolution. So we come from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence into adulthood, young adulthood, from young adulthood into mature adulthood, into old age. So these are all stages, and it's always a transition, leaving behind what we thought we knew or thought we were, and becoming that which is yet to be fully known. So if you even look at every human being, it's engaged in a natural evolutionary process. So we're in a dream to think that doesn't continue. It's not even realistic to think there's a whole different paradigm when you die from the one that's brought you to that point of your death. It is all part of the same movement. You know, ask a shoot from a seed, what's the world? Well, it's dark, it's dirty, it's muddy. I don't know anything. And it's a lot of effort pushing through all this density and muck. Periodically I hit stones and rocks, you know, if you could talk. And I don't know where I'm going. It's struggle and effort, not knowing what's struggle and effort, if you could ask if there was a consciousness in a plant. And it only knows when it's broken through the surface. And then there's a complete different paradigm. Now the plant doesn't have a human mind, so it doesn't resist the next stage where the shoot grows stronger and starts putting out leaves and it matures and goes through the process of vulnerability to wind and animals and the vicissitudes of creation that would determine if it survives or not. So it doesn't resist like we resist. That's the curse of self-awareness. We keep thinking it could be different. We keep believing it should be different. And we don't understand why it is the way it is, and so we constantly seek to control things so that they won't change. And somehow we create these tremendously effective blockages to our own natural evolution. And we call that pain and suffering. And we attribute that pain and suffering to other people in our lives, to our circumstances, to our current state of health, to the weather, to the smoke in the air, to whatever, rather than know that we are simply in a process of resistance to a process that is actually beyond us and is eventually going to win. Like I like to say, is when you awaken, you can go smoothly or you can go kicking or screaming. But the torrent's going to take you in the same direction, if you like it or not. There's a lot less pain when you quit resisting it or trying to change it or to fix it or to make it smoother or more comfortable. I guess that's the gist of it. So when you are engaged with that in you which resists, which is invested in the old ways, invested in keeping the ego intact, invested in keeping things in the way that you're comfortable, invested in having the things you've identified with as important, the issues that you've made about who you are, and your attachment to yourself as those issues, or the stories you've created about how the world is and how you are and what's possible and what's not possible. You become invested in these things. You become identified with all these parts, thinking, that's me. You become the belief. You become the story. And to have someone question your belief or question your story is an act of war. It's a how dare you, and who do you think you are? Or it's, oh my God, I'm defeated. Someone's overtaken me, and I'm lost and confused and crushed. So in many ways, the analogy is true of the Bhagavad Gita, that we're in a process, all of us are. That's a battlefield, even if our minds think, oh, it's all good now. I've got a house, I've got money, I've got a bank account, I'm protected. They can't get me here. So that'll last only for a while. You will not survive this journey. Who you think you are as an ego will not survive. Just like the child's ego could not survive being a child when it became an older child, when it left the sandbox, when it left its shiny, bright toys, rubber toys, and became Tonka trucks or whatever the people use these days. Now I guess it's all computerized, but anyway. And so each of us have actually let go of our old stuff, but often there is this turbulent period. So this stage, this piece of the Bhagavad Gita is speaking of the battle of emerging from a previous paradigm, previous way of being, a previous way of seeing the world, a previous way of seeing yourself, into a new way that has not yet formed, has not yet articulated itself. And who's standing in this battle? In this Bhagavad Gita, there's two. There's the Kauravas, who represent the forces of darkness. I call them the forces of inertia, or tamas and rajas, that either are clinging or resisting, trying to control or change. So these are the forces that exist in each of us that resist change, or want to control the change, or have it go different than the way it's wanting to go. So these are the Kauravas, and they are different attributes. And at this stage of the soul, when the soul has reached this stage of the development of consciousness, this is a very sophisticated consciousness. This is not an ordinary human being, just getting by, drinking beer, watching TV, screwing their husband or their wife and having kids and getting through life pretending you're not going to die. And it's always surprised when it happens. So it's not that anymore. You're alert. There's a problem here. There's an issue here. And how do I live? How do I be? Why am I here? What's the purpose of this whole thing? And so we begin a quest. By this point, we have been questing. We have been seeking. We've been trying to find what's real, what's true. We've been developing our mind. We've been stopping taking actions that keep creating pain. And we start creating actions that create more and more harmony, more and more understanding, more and more cooperation. So by this point, the human intelligence has reached a certain maturity. Now, it might not just be mental. Some people come to this in their heart. They come with an empathetic, a capacity to feel what it's like for other people, not just what's good for them or what's not good for them, but this empathetic relationship to the world around them. These are the artists and the poets, the writers, Um, the people who have sensitivities that are much more felt than mental. So it can be both. It can be both in your intelligence, in understanding yourself and the nature of the world and how to function and how to operate, or it can be your heart, which becomes more and more open, less and less contracted, and more capable of receiving. Either of these are signs of the soul has reached a certain state of maturity. And that means that basically that which has held us contracted begins to relax. That which has kept us in our identification with matter, lock, stock, and barrel, chains and concrete and in every other way it can be, begins to lose its ability to hold us. We don't know this is happening. We just feel better when we're sitting in nature than when we're grubbing and striving to get more and more and more of what we think we need or think we want. We notice that when we are in certain circumstances, we read certain materials about the higher possibility of consciousness, about cooperation between societies or people, we become uplifted. We talk about improving the world or making the world a better place. We begin to open up to a sense of purpose beyond just our own little selfish purpose or the purpose of our little ego's investment with the family, with its community, with its race, with its religion, with its country. And we become more and more expanded in this process. So even though the ego is still getting identified, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. As the ego still gets identified, it's still in a larger context than the individual ego at home with the kids and the wife and the husband and the job and the money and all that. This expansion and in the context, the broadness of the context is also an indication. And with this broadening of this paradigm, I call it, is actually an increasing of your consciousness. You're becoming aware of more than what you were aware of before. You're becoming aware. And as you become more aware, you become more responsive to what you become aware of than what you weren't when you weren't aware of it. You become more and more engaged in that new expanded awareness. And then you find a place to be in that new expanded awareness. And that's what makes you, I'm going to, fight for the good, or I'm going to make sure nothing changes. You take a position on a broader point of view. But it's still this movement into a broader paradigm. The awareness expands, you become more responsible. When you become more able to respond, you grow into that new paradigm. When you take on some responsibility in that expanded paradigm, it becomes established for you. And then the next paradigm starts opening up. And this is how human beings evolved. From their little tribe to the village, to the medieval cities, city-states, to publication and communication, to enterprise, to cities and countries, and to where we are now. There has been an evolution in the collective consciousness, and of which we become more and more aware of and partake in it more and more as our own consciousness expands and we become more aware and we take a position in that. We vote a certain way. We feel we can make a difference and we participate. So this is what happens to consciousness as it reaches the end of its maturity in its human identification. It starts taking on causes. It starts looking to be a good person. It starts looking to have integrity, to keep promises, to do the right thing, to stand up for truth, to protect the weak, to support those that need protection, to help those who are in need. This is a natural, we become idealists. We create a sense of morality and ethics. These are the forces that are being described in detail when you look in the Bhagavad Gita, that are on the opposing side. Being a better human being, being even a noble and admirable human being, even a great human being, is still being a human being. It hasn't begun the true transition, where consciousness begins to take its attention away from its identification with everything around it and begins to turn its attention on its own nature. This turning of attention from who you are as a person, as your thoughts, as your story, your ideas of the world, your ideas of yourself, that are outward oriented. Your wife, your family, your job, the amount of money you have in the bank, how you think other people think of you, all these things, and you start turning them in, you become more and more aware of what it is that actually assigns meaning and value and identity. This process is a struggle and it's effort. These first 10 verses of the Gita sets the paradigm, the circumstances of the Gita. It lets you know that this is not about happiness and harmony and cooperation and a bunch of new tricks how to get along with people and get along with yourself and to feel good. It is about a struggle to move into the correct relationship to what is actually true beyond even the human paradigm, true beyond even the human relationship. What is lasting? What is eternal? Dejection is that point of transition from the vantage point of what it feels like. Which you could say it feels like shit. It feels bad. And as we get further in the next class of the Bhagavad Gita, we'll talk something about the symptoms of dejection and how to recognize it in yourself. And what are the natures of this state of dejection. Just to give you a taste, dejection always thinks it's too much. It thinks it can't do it. It thinks it's impossible to bear, or it's impossible to be that way. Because what it is so habituated to being small. It doesn't know how to be large. It thinks it can't be large. It thinks that it has to make itself large. It has to make itself different. But in fact, it's a natural process. It's something we surrender to. It's not something we do. So the nature of dejection is you're experiencing your vulnerability. You're experiencing being outside of what your comfort zone is. You're experiencing being overtaken or feeling it's too much, but you don't know why. So that's a preview. And we'll talk about that when we have our next class. Okay, but just in case, just to give it another minute, anybody has any questions or comments at this stage? Okay, so in the handout, there are questions for contemplation at the very last page. So between now and our next class, review the handout, begin to sink into this inquiry. Just,
I had a question.
okay, Anonymous.
Before you talked about that there's a difference between the human dejection and the dejection that when you have let self.
There's a difference between dejection as a human experience and dejection as the we're describing here as a transition in the spiritual path. Correct.
So what would you say how would you describe
So that's what we'll talk about in our next class.
Good segue.
Yes.
I have a question. Do we have to be successful in the world, either in this lifetime or a previous lifetime, like becoming a really powerful, rich, or famous person before we go on this, before we reach the dejection and go on the path?
It's a good question, because how long does it take that particular ray of consciousness to become painfully aware of how bound it is different. I believe that we all have a colored ray, you might say, a ray of consciousness that gets invested in matter with different capacities, which change as we go through processes of evolution. But for the most part, we all complete the human journey proportionately to whatever it is that actually, I feel, is our ultimate dharma, Some people have to reach a much more accomplished stage in the human development because their purpose is much greater after their realization. Others, it is simply to come to the truth of who they are, and therefore the training or the necessity of that kind of exposure is not as great. This is predetermined right from the very beginning of the first ray. It came with the characteristic of the ray. So it's essential, you might say essential to the nature of the soul. And then it takes shape as time goes on through the evolutionary process and finds its avenue in each of us. These rays are endless, billions and trillions, uncountable rays. Each ray has its own unique vibration. That's why each of us have this own unique vibration, why each snowflake is different from every other snowflake. We all have a different purpose. We all have a different capacity. And it's not us who determines that.
From the human to the return path, is there a distinct point where you know you've turned the corner?
So from the human to the return path, from the evolutionary stage into the return journey, you're the last to know. It's just like somebody who's asleep is beginning to wake up. And they're stirring and twitching and shuffling around. Someone observing them can say, oh, this person's trying to wake up. But the person who's asleep still thinks they're still is asleep. So when you actually become aware you're asleep, you're actually awake. Or in the first stages of the awakening process. So that opening your eyes, when you first wake up, you open your eyes and you don't see anything. Nothing does not compute. You're just there, and before you realize, oh, I'm in the bed, it's morning, I got to get up, brush my teeth, all that. So this is the process. So you don't know. Somebody else can see it, just like a woman who's had a child can recognize the stage of another woman by being with her and noticing her symptoms and so on and so forth. So too, the only person who can know is one who's gone through the journey themselves. That particular transition, they could be able to assist you and say, you're actually trying to wake up. So I don't suggest you go run after another relationship. I don't suggest that you keep drunk all the time. I suggest you try this or that. This is what we call spiritual guidance. Okay, answer that question? Okay.
So you're describing this painful natural process, bodily process of coming to the self, and that you can't know what's going on, and yet it's striking me what you said is just a slightly different interpretation. The Vedic interpretations, like Ramana said the same thing of like trying to go through samsara, thinking you're a body or thinking you're a person is like trying to cross. A river on the back of an alligator. His simple solution is like most Indian thought, it's just like an intellectual solution. Just, you're not a person, so then you're not going to get it. Of course you're not going to get it. Don't be a person. Just get clear that you're not a person. You're conscious.
Okay. So the question is,
from the very beginning that you're on the journey and you're not waiting through this awful process, you're still thinking you're a person waiting to transform.
got it. So let's stop there because I have to re-say what you said. So basically, the question was, is it necessary to go through all this suffering without knowing you're suffering? And the answer to that is, you're going to go through the suffering if you know it or not. But if you know it, if you can understand it, if you can intellectually contextualize what's happening to you, it's easier. It doesn't mean you're suffering. Actually, suffering is mostly resistance. Suffering is mostly rebellion. Suffering is the, I don't want it this way. That's what suffering is. When we give that up, and if you have a context, even an intellectual context for the process, it makes the suffering more palatable. We don't resist it as long. We let it do its work. Just like the caterpillar has to surrender to its own dissolving. The only difference between us and the caterpillar is we can resist it. Which is the curse and the blessing that each of us self-aware beings have. We can choose And that's why it hurts. Okay, that's enough. So now we'll complete with a silent sitting.